Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. And this is a video on promises. This is one of the few things I still haven't yet to do a video on in JavaScript. I've done some periphery videos on it, like talking about like fetch and async await, whatnot, but I figured, now's the time to do it. So let's talk a little bit about the point of promises, the evolution of promises. So essentially what happens is that when you're dealing with the web, things can't always be synchronous. Synchronous just means that everything gets run in sequence. So imagine you have to go get a CSS file because your code is going to go fetch this CSS file or fetch this JavaScript file or fetch this image. And the problem is it takes a long time. It might take 3 seconds, let's say, to load that image. In synchronous code, the code would just stop until that's done. And that could take a while. Okay, and that would be, slow down the user experience. So the question is always become, how do you make the code asynchronous? How do you make these things that are sort of happening based on like pulling information from somewhere else happen without stopping the rest of your code from doing its thing? So one way you do it is, before there was promises, is you would use callbacks. So essentially what you would do, and all a callback is a function that takes a function. So let's say here's my func, okay, and the function does things. What I would do is then maybe pass a callback in there, so I'd pass another function in there, and basically this function, in the actual like function definition, this function would run after this function does what it's doing. Okay, so this way, this basically creates this sort of chain of functions that works its way down, but you'd end up with a callback hell because maybe in this function I need another function to happen. So then I do like my func again. So I call this other function that also takes a callback, and this gets a little crazy. So say, let's see how this will format it. Okay, but I mean you end up with something kind of like this after a while, and you see how it's kind of like going out like this. Well, imagine that 3 or 4 more levels deep, you get this kind of pyramid structure, and then it kind of collapses back in. And that's referred to as callback hell. It's just one callback after another callback. And each function is waiting for things to happen before the function gets called, which allows you to accomplish that sort of asynchronous effect. But syntactically, it was a pain to read, because you're seeing functions and functions and functions and functions and functions. So people created libraries that dealt with this. Eventually, JavaScript finally added sort of a built-in way to deal with this called the promise. And basically the way the promise would work is like this. So let's say I would say const my prom equals a new promise. Okay, why is it? Oh, let me just save. A new promise, okay? Now the promise does take a callback in its constructor, okay? Because see, it's an object because we're using the new keyword. And basically, what happens is that we're gonna say, okay, this is what the promise is intending to do, and this is how we know if it happened or didn't happen. Now this function takes 2 parameters: resolve, which is the function that basically is passing it this function that says, okay, run this when things go well. And reject, which is the second parameter, is this function that runs if things go wrong. Okay, and then you do the function. So I'm saying my promise equals, we'll say if 5 equals 5, then you will resolve, and then this returns some information. So resolve 5, and else if 5 does not equal 5, else reject, it don't work. Okay, and then that's essentially what's happening here. And again, what happens here, like the if, could be all sorts of crazy things, like connecting to a database and pulling information or whatnot. Okay, so basically here you would code it actually getting the information you need, and then only resolving it if it completes. Okay, what makes this unique than just creating an if statement is that once the promise is created, code doesn't stop. It doesn't wait for the promise to resolve or reject. Your code will just keep on going. Stuff will happen afterwards. So if I do, let's say, console.log hello, and then we do my prom.then, and see, like, my prom is right with my promise. .then basically says, hey, don't run the code that's in the .then until the promise resolves. Okay, so then what you would do is this .then function takes the callback. That is sort of your result. So your result is your parameter. Okay. And then we'll just console log result. So we'll console.log the result only when the result which is, comes back, whether it's resolved or rejected. Console.log result. Okay. And then here we'll console.log goodbye. So the way this code works, a new promise is created. This promise will go through this chain of events, but the code will continue to go on. Let's see how it kind of plays out. Now, take a look at the order that the things happen. Notice, it says hello, then goodbye, then 5. Okay? Because basically what happens is that the way JavaScript works, especially when you're working with like the V8 engine or Node, it's running in a loop. So it sees this promise, it initiates a promise, okay? Like if I were the console.log my prom, here, what's gonna happen is you're gonna see, like, let's take a look at what it prints out, and then we'll explain it. Save. Okay, so in that case, at that point, it has already resolved. I just hadn't specified what happens when it resolves. So, and which makes sense because the task I ask it to do doesn't really take any time. But the point is, basically what happens is that JavaScript reads that a new promise is created, but it doesn't wait for it to finish. So even if that took like a fraction of a millisecond, it still has already moved on. Okay, it'll then read console.log hello. It skips the .then unless it had already resolved, or actually just kind of skips anything to do with that promise for the time being. Goes to the rest of your code and then returns to see if the promise resolved, and then executes the .then. That's why the 5, this 5, which is technically this console log here, happens last, even though it's placed second. So again, the idea is that promises happen outside of the normal order of your code, and that's why they're cool. Okay, so then again, you probably won't be designing many of your own promises like this, but when you're using like the fetch API in a browser to like fetch documents, or using Axios, or you're using pretty much all the functions in Express and most of the backend stuff, a lot of those are asynchronous functions, and you'll notice that a lot of times they require you to chain these .thens, because technically what's going on under the hood of the function is that there is a what's the word I'm looking for? There is a promise. Okay, there's a promise under the hood that's waiting to be resolved. Okay, and then you do these .thens. Although, again, you may be chaining many different asynchronous functions. So then you start having the situation where you start chaining .thens, and you end up in callback hell there. And that's where like async await comes in. Async await makes it even prettier. Okay, because again, there might be some other promise that I need resolved, and then I have to wait for that to resolve. And then I pass in another callback into that dot then, and that just all still, you still kind of end up in the same place. It's a little bit nicer. Okay, actually I don't even need to do that. Like, it gets prettier because we do this. I don't have to do the dot. Well, if there's another promise that gets resolved in here, then I can just chain the dot then here. So that's why it doesn't get quite as pyramidy, because I can just chain the dot thens. But then you might end up with like, dot then, this can go on forever. And you have these long dot then chains. So basically what async await does, it provides a syntax to allow you to do these asynchronous options. So I'm not going to run this code, it's just to show you. So let's say I had that promise. Okay, what I would do is I would create a function, const myfunc, and then I would say it's an async function. So it would be, the syntax would look like this. Okay, so this tells JavaScript that this function may have asynchronous stuff go inside of it. So then what I would do is I'd say, hey, I want to go fetch some API call. I want to save the result of that call in a variable called response, and then I would do equal. I use the keyword await fetch, and then I put the URL here that I'm fetching. And essentially, because what fetch does, it's a promise. It says, okay, I'm gonna go get information from this URL, and if it comes back, we're gonna resolve it, and if it doesn't come back for some reason, we'll throw an error. Okay. And then you would then have to do like a dot then. Normally, if you don't do this async await thing, then you have to do like dot then with all the stuff that happens on that fetch. But with async await, basically what happens is that this stops the function and says, okay, function, don't move forward until this is done, and this is stored in this variable. Okay, and once I have that response, and then I can say, hey, you know what? That response is just pure text. I need to turn it into like a JSON object so I can work with it. So I need to store it in a variable. We'll store it in a variable called JSON. So I'm going to say, hey, response, turn it into JSON. So we'll do response.json. And but the thing is that since this function relies on this to resolve first, again, I just put await again here. And so again, this will wait for this to finish, store the results here. This will wait for this to finish, put the results here, because each of these functions return a promise, so you can do that. Okay? And now I can then work with the JSON variable going forward in the function, but notice I didn't have to do any kind of weird pyramiding or weird stacking of different chaining of functions. It's just more, it looks synchronous. It looks like just a list of commands, which is just a nicer syntax. That's the purpose of async await. It just looks nicer than doing a whole bunch of callbacks or chaining a bunch of dot thens with promises. So that's why async await is cool. The thing is, you have to do it within functions that you mark async. So keep that in mind. So you oftentimes have to sit there and like define the function ahead of time. You could do like, and you can do it anywhere. Anywhere you have an arrow function, you can just do async, etc. Or, you know, if you're doing just a normal function, I think it would be function async. Or it might be, I always forget the normal function syntax. Async function name. Yeah. Either way, the point is that async keyword needs to be there somewhere, so that way you can use the await keyword in the function. And then basically any function that's inside your function that would normally just return a promise, you could do it in that much nicer syntax. It does take a while to get used to. I won't say I still sometimes imperfectly predict where I should be using my awaits, so I oftentimes use more awaits than I need to, but it's neat. And that's all promises are. Again, a promise just means you've sent me to go do something. I'm going to come back eventually, but go do other stuff while I finish the stuff that you told me to go do, which may take me some time. So I promise I'll come back to you with an answer later. Thus the term promise. It's something that you're going to get later. Okay, so hopefully that gives you some more information on promises. Thank you guys very much. Have a great day and enjoy.